Well, howdy partners. Thanks for watching another ARFCOM news thing. In today's deep dive, we'll push deep into the mushy topic of ATF opinions. If you've been following the news of the pews much, you've probably heard about how the ATF made up some new arbitrary rule or how they lost another court case over one of their stupid rules. But maybe you have a hard time figuring out why the executive branch seems to be writing legislation. Or maybe you like gazing into my eyes while my silken voice lulls you to sleep. Or maybe you just need something to watch while you poop. In any case, buckle in and keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times while we take a deep dive into the fetid waters of the National Firearms Act and arbitrary ATF rules. But first, I want to take a moment to remind you that anything worth shooting is worth shooting twice, and going binary will not trigger the Fed boys. Today's video is generously sponsored by Franklin Armory, so if you enjoy longer form content like this and you want to see us make more of it, please give Franklin Armory some love.
Franklin Armory, those freedom facilitators who brought you twice the pews with their binary firing system, because it's a scientific fact that bad guys with twice as many holes in them are half as dangerous. So in the unfortunate event you should ever need your firearm for defense, remember, it's math. It can't be wrong.
Our story begins nearly a century ago as the Prohibition was drawing to a close. The noble experiment had proven a colossal and predictable failure by creating artificial scarcity for a commodity anyone can make at home with ease. Sound familiar? We'll come back to that later. As any idiot could have told you would happen, Prohibition only made crime profitable, creating public demand for politicians to do something about organized crime. Although machine guns, silencers, short-barreled rifles, and shotguns, and hand grenades weren't actually all that common with gangsters, the Tommy gun was a constant staple in Hollywood movies about gangsters and made an easy target. So politicians got to work crafting legislation to infringe on the right to bear arms. Now they knew they couldn't get away with an outright ban on all guns, so they created a cumbersome bureaucratic process and a $200 tax. As I'm sure you're aware, dollars were worth a great deal more back then. That $200 would be worth almost $5,000 today. In a time when wages were hard to come by and it was raining stockbrokers in New York, this was intended to be a virtual ban on all but the wealthiest of people, who could afford to pay $5 grand in taxes today. The devices which made it into the National Firearms Act of 1934 are machine guns, silencers, short-barrel rifles, short-barrel shotguns, destructive devices, and any other weapons. Handguns were originally intended to be part of the de facto ban, which is the reason short-barreled rifles and shotguns were also included in the first place. Those provisions were intended to prevent a loophole in the de facto handgun ban where a person could have a sort of handgun just by chopping a rifle or a shotgun down to more or less pistol size. But lawmakers lacked the political capital to effectively ban all handguns. Still, the short barrel sections remained regardless. So if you wanted to own any of these naughty things, you would have to fill out a bunch of paperwork and send a check to the government, then wait. How long? Who knows? They get to it when, they get to it. As time went on, inflation caused the value of that $200 tax stamp to decrease until in 1986, it was worth the equivalent of about $574 today. So as more regular folks could afford them, it became more and more common for people to own machine guns. But in 1986, the Hughes Amendment was added to the Firearms Owners Protection Act, which closed the NFA registry for machine guns. No new machine guns could be added to the registry.
That makes me a sad panda.
Of course, this enforced scarcity for machine guns which could be legally transferred to private owners resulted in constant increases in value and tidy profits for certain wealthy elites over the intervening years. It's probably just a coincidence some influential rich people own machine guns, and repealing the Hughes Amendment would cause their investments to evaporate. So while the NFA registry is closed for machine guns, you can still buy or make other NFA devices by filing filing the appropriate paperwork and paying a $200 tax. It's quite common for people to make legal homemade silencers on a Form 1. And if you want to turn your AR-15 pistol into a registered short barrel rifle, you just fill out a Form 1, pay the tax, engrave the lower, and wait. Then you can put a stock on it when you get the stamp back. But what if you want a shorter AR and you don't want to pay $200 and wait a year to pass go? Well, you could buy a pistol based on the same design. After the '94 assault weapon ban expired in 2004, it became legal again to manufacture pistols which weighed more than 50 ounces unloaded.
10 boxes.
So the late 2000s saw a boom in AR pistols. You can't just take the stock off your AR rifle though. The ATF has decreed that if a gun was manufactured as a rifle, it can never be a pistol. But if it was manufactured as a pistol, it can be converted to a rifle and back and forth as often as you wish. In other words, it could go one way or both ways, but not the other way. Don't try to make it make sense. So the lower or completed gun has to be transferred on the 4473 as a pistol or simply firearm, but not as a rifle. It's not uncommon for people to build an AR as a pistol while they wait for a Form 1 to clear, then manufacture a short barrel rifle by engraving the receiver and adding a stock. The neat thing about the AR design is the buffer tube is an important functioning part of the gun, and the ATF had issued letters long ago stating it was not illegal to place that buffer tube against your shoulder. Manufacturers made pistol buffer tubes which had no provision for attaching a stock and sometimes with foam padding on them. Home builders often wrapped the buffer tube with 550 cord or otherwise made it very clear there was no intent to attach a stock. Because the ATF invented this idea called constructive intent, where if you have the things you need to build a naughty item, that's the same thing as actually having the naughty item. Of course, that means anyone who has a glass bottle, a flammable liquid, and a scrap of cloth somewhere in their home is guilty of constructive possession of an unregistered destructive device because Molotov cocktails are specifically listed in the NFA. And anybody who has a plastic bottle, tape, and a .22 LR pistol is theoretically in constructive possession of a silencer. So that's, dumb. Then in 2013, SB Tactical partnered with Sig Sauer to bring pistol braces to the market. Although AR-based pistols were already legal, they weren't especially easy to shoot in the intended manner, especially for anybody with impaired hand and arm strength. SB Tactical's design made it possible for people with disabilities to shoot AR pattern firearms at all and made it easier for the rest of us to shoot AR pistols one-handed. Being able to shoot an AR-style pistol one-handed is important because although the NFA does not define a pistol, the 1968 Gun Control Act defines a pistol as a weapon with a short stock designed to be gripped with one hand. That one-handed part is why the ATF considers a pistol with a vertical foregrip to be an AOW, because if it has a second grip, they claim it is intended to be grasped by two hands. Apparently, a foregrip which isn't quite perfectly vertical is somehow obviously not designed to be grasped by the offhand. Again, don't try to make it make sense. Now, obviously, putting two hands on a pistol does not change its design. A Glock or a 1911 is designed to be gripped by one hand, but using two hands is of course perfectly acceptable. Likewise, a pistol with a brace is clearly intended to be fired with one hand, and placing the brace against the shoulder doesn't change the design of the gun. Or at least, it didn't at first. Then the ATF issued an opinion letter in early 2015 expressing the opinion that placing a stabilizing brace against the shoulder constitutes redesigning the firearm as a short barrel rifle. Then, 2 years after that, the ATF issued another opinion letter which slightly walked back the 2015 letter without really conclusively saying anything at all. It's full of bureaucratic doublespeak, but if I may paraphrase, it goes something like this. Well, sure, we said placing a brace against your shoulder turns the gun into an unregistered NFA device, but what we really meant was if an end user modified the brace to make it less of a brace and more of a stock and then used it as a stock, then that would constitute redesigning the gun as a short barrel rifle. This letter was taken by pretty much everybody as blanket approval for braces to be pseudo stocks, and it was back to green flag racing with the market exploding with pistol braces. Then, in the dark days of December 2020, the ATF issued an open letter attempting to clarify some of the factors they use to determine whether a given firearm is subject to the NFA, and asked for comments. Then they closed the comment period, then they opened it again. The rule they published for public comment included a bizarre and confusing score sheet where an end user was expected to add up points to figure out whether his gun was legal or not. Ultimately, the ATF scrapped that score sheet and issued a confusing and arbitrary rule which left everyone still in the dark about what was clearly allowed and what was not. Then they lost several court cases about the rule on the grounds they violated the Administrative Procedures Act. They could still publish a restrictive rule if they followed the APA this time, but their position is also weakened by the loss of Chevron deference. Chevron deference is this principle that courts would just let bureaucrats make up whatever rules they wanted if Congress wasn't explicit enough in statute. But without that deference, it will be more difficult for the ATF to enforce any of their rules. This issue is likely to continue to resurface periodically because the ATF is in the unfortunate position of being charged with enforcing an ambiguous law. That said, it's not likely they'll go around arresting anyone on technical violations alone. If you're not out there trafficking baby fentanyls and passing bad checks, you're unlikely to get their attention in the first place. But what if you want to be all like pew, 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 instead of pew, pew, pew though? The 1934 NFA defines a machine gun as being able to shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger, and it imposes a $200 tax on machine guns. Like I told you earlier, the Hughes Amendment to the 1986 McClure-Volkmer Act, also known as the Firearms Owners Protection Act, closed the NFA registry, making it illegal to manufacture or import any new machine guns for the proletariat, which caused prices to skyrocket. Nowadays, a transferable MAC-10 will cost you at least 7 Gs. Mind you, that's for a simple open bolt submachine gun. Semi-auto versions, which are mechanically more complicated, sell for about $400. Because NFA devices in general and machine guns in particular are often out of reach for commoners, there have been numerous devices over the years which attempt to simulate full auto fire in one way or another. Some, like the Hellfire trigger system, which was advertised widely in the 80s and 90s, are kinda janky. Some, like various trigger cranks, are a little more functional, but they're still awkward to use and are often cheaply made. Most of these trigger actuator-based designs are perfectly legal so long as they're not powered, and the ATF has never had an issue with any of them. In my admittedly less than humble opinion, one of the coolest designs by far is this dual 1022 Gatling thingy. But in 2002, Bill Akins began selling the Akins Accelerator stock. It was a replacement stock for Ruger 1022 rifles, which allowed the whole barreled action to move within the stock. There was a ledge to place your finger against when you pulled the trigger, and the recoil would cause the gun to move to the rear in the stock, then spring pressure would push it forward again against your finger. If you continued to hold your finger in the same place, that spring pressure would cause you to press the trigger again as the gun moved forward in the stock. The ATF originally stated this was a separate function of the trigger in the context of the NFA and was therefore legal. But in 2006, they changed their mind again and decreed the Akins Accelerator to be a machine gun. Well, they decided it was a machine gun if the spring was installed in it. Now, bump stocks work under pretty much the same principle as the Akins Accelerator, except without that internal spring. Because the user has to maintain forward hand pressure on the handguard to continue firing, it was widely accepted, and the ATF agreed that bump stocks were perfectly legal. And it's clear to anyone with the sense the good Lord gave a pile of sand that a separate function of the trigger is still required for each shot. But the ATF changed their collective mind once again under direction from President Trump and proclaimed bump stocks to be machine guns because they say so. At this point, the ATF also decided Akins accelerators were machine guns, with or without the spring. But this is clearly an untenable position, and after a protracted court battle, the ATF lost this case as well, with the Supreme Court deciding in Cargill versus Garland, the ATF does not have the authority to rewrite the laws Congress passed. Forced reset triggers are another way to get more pews per second out of your heater, and they represent another humiliating loss for the feds. A forced reset trigger works by using the inertia of the bolt carrier to push the trigger forward as the bolt closes, making it easy to pull the trigger for the next shot. As with bump stocks, this still requires a separate function of the trigger, but the Fed boys nevertheless attempted to ban FRTs by royal decree as well. The National Association for Gun Rights sued, and the Fed boys lost again. By now, you may be sensing a sort of pattern with the ATF's cases, so you probably have an idea where this next one is going, and you'd be right. Making guns at home is an American tradition older than America itself. Control freaks are terrified by homemade guns because they're impossible to catalog, which complicates their plans to confiscate guns. Remember, the only reason for a list of gun owners is so you know who to take the guns from, and the only reason someone has for trying to take away your gun is they intend to do something they couldn't get away with if you were armed.
They come for all like us.
So the feds tried to destroy some of the businesses that support the homemade gun scene by issuing arbitrary rules again. Except, as with the prohibition on alcohol, it is ridiculously stupid to try to ban people from having something any idiot can make at home. And you don't even need a bathtub to print a gun. But the courts were having none of that either. And despite losing case after case, the federal government remained doggedly determined to destroy the legal homemade gun industry, and to some extent, they were successful at it. They drove Polymer 80 out of business, at least for the time being. That brings us up to present day, and as I record this, every single one of the ATF's controversial and arbitrary rules has failed in court. If that on its own wasn't enough to convince you to ignore ATF rules, consider this. The ATF doesn't have the authority to write law, and they won't be your judge or jury either. When the ATF issues an opinion, it is literally just that. Their opinion. They are essentially saying they believe these conditions violate the law as Congress wrote it, and they are claiming they would be willing to prosecute someone under those conditions, except they are often not willing to actually bring cases to trial. Because if they lose at trial, they might lose bigly. It's not just the rule in question that's at risk. They could face getting entire sections of the NFA, the GCA, or other gun control laws struck down. So their signature move is to file charges and go through all the motions right up until just before the trial they drop charges, like they did to Joseph Rowe. Joseph Rowe ran a business that helped people build their own ARs on his premises. The ATF really wanted to run him out of business, but they knew if they brought the case to trial, the court would likely find their opinion about which part of an AR-15 is the receiver to be inconsistent with federal law. The problem is the law defined a receiver as that part of a firearm which provides the housing for the hammer, bolt, or breech lock and firing mechanism, and which is usually threaded at its forward position to receive the barrel. In an AR, the upper receiver contains some of those parts, and the lower receiver contains a few of the other parts. A strict interpretation of the law would mean the upper was the receiver, or both parts together are the receiver, but the lower most especially does not fit the description because more of the parts are in the upper. They went with that interpretation because it was convenient for them and for the industry, largely because Armalite had already chosen to serialize lowers when they started making ARs for the military. The ATF knew they would lose in court, but they also knew they didn't need to win in court. They know they can get what they want by making the process the punishment. They know they can harass businesses into closing their doors, and they know they are unlikely to face any personal consequences, at least in the short term. But the courts have rejected Chevron deference, which is the principle which emboldened the bureaucrats to pass arbitrary rules, and the ATF is steadily losing the power they once wielded. Now, to be clear, I am not telling you to disregard federal law. I'm telling you the ATF doesn't have the authority to write law, and they have been proven wrong time after time after time. In the rare circumstances they are even willing to bring charges against you, they will likely drop the case before trial. So yeah, obey the law, but you can probably ignore ATF rules. Of course, I'm not a lawyer because my parents were married and this is not legal advice. But keep your head up. Don't get discouraged. Nature is healing. Who knows? Maybe someday we will even repeal the NFA altogether.
Stuff's getting better. Stuff's getting better every day.
In the meantime, please continue to donate to all of the worthy gun rights groups out there working to make that happen. And please support our sponsors. Without them, we literally couldn't bring you quality 2A propaganda like this. I love you.